For me, trains are about getting from A to B, but there are people of all ages who love the romance of the golden age of the railway.
When the first train left Great Victoria Street for Lisburn in 1839, it changed our lives forever. Fast, dangerous and exciting, the railway sped up the pace of industry, commerce and communication. At one time, almost everyone in the country lived within 5 miles of a station. People who had never been out of their hometown or village could take a trip to the city or spend a day at the seaside.
I'm much too young to remember all that, but I've spoken to people up and down the country who can't understand why most of our railway network was abandoned almost 50 years ago.
I want to find out what the attraction is, to see if there's any trace left of these old lines, any hidden history to be found in some of the places they pass through.
And that brings us to tomorrow. Temperatures will rise to about 18 or 19 degrees for many of us. Then as we look ahead towards the rest of the week and into the weekend, plenty more dry weather to come. Well, there you are. That was the weather. Not looking too bad at all. Perfect for getting away from the weather desk for a few days to walk the line.
My journey today takes me from Belleek on the Fermanagh-Cavan border via Enniskillen to the Donegal coast at Bundoran. I'll be joined by an artist who has taken inspiration from walking the line.
You could almost sense the ghosts of those great steam engines.
I'll be discovering how the railways were used in a game of espionage during World War II. And paying a visit to one of the most unusual museums in Ireland.
This is Belleek Station. For almost 70 years, it was a hub of activity. The post came here, newspapers, goods for shops, and farmers loaded their cattle here to be taken to market in Belfast. The line closed in 1957, but the station house and the signal box have been lovingly preserved. You can almost imagine the train pulling in along the platform.
I'm meeting the owner of this pretty station house, Maria O'Dolan, to find out what it was like here in the heyday of the railways.
It was the life and soul of the village, and there was passenger trains, goods trains and cattle trains. The best and most exciting times were the cattle trains. There used to be big fairs up in the west of Ireland, you see, and big heavy cattle, and they were brought down by wagons here and shipped to England. The cattle trains came in October, late at night, an ideal time for the cubs, and they were all out. And there'd be 14 or 15 big wagons on it, full of heavy cattle. And once you got as far as down, you can see it from here, to Tome. There's an incline up to and she'd stall and put up steam. And the shouts and the roars of cattle and the shouts of men and the blowing of whistles, that village was kept awake half the night. Turkey plucking took place here. Like the cattle, the turkeys came at Christmas by train, live turkeys, and they were put in the store. And they were choked and plucked. 3D for a hen and 4D for a cock rooster of turkey cock because he was harder to pluck, right? A gold mine came to Belleek in the form of turkey plucking in the 1930s.
It's no wonder the people of Belleek were glad when the first train arrived here in 1878.
The whole country was out to welcome it in, and they cheered it in, right? Now, the name of it was the Fogabala. The engines, they all had names, and that was the first one. Fogabala means clear the way. It was an old Irish war cry, clear the way, and very appropriate.
Why have you worked so hard to restore this place?
Because I feel it's part of our heritage, and it's slowly been done away with. And it's good to have the young people know that up here was the railway.
This home movie was made the day the last train left Belleek in 1957. From Belleek, the railway line meandered through the Fermanagh countryside, stopping at Abohill and Florence Court on its way to Enniskillen. If you know what to look for, there's plenty of evidence of where it went. Old station houses and abandoned bridges. In fact, this road has been built on top of the track bed of the railway. But I'm not the first to notice all this. Artist Seamus Dunbar recently walked the line himself, documenting what he discovered along the way.
And I'd been very interested in the railway for a long time, from seeing traces of it in the area that I live, and I'd always wanted to do something about it, so this seemed a great opportunity to explore it in more depth.
And how difficult was it to get from A to B, essentially?
It was quite a journey. I mean, parts of the railway are very overgrown, and where there were bridges over rivers and streams, they've all been removed, so they had to be crossed by various means. I kayaked across the Arn, swam across the border, and other rivers had to be waded and forded by various means. So
Quite adventurous.
Quite an adventure, you know.
What did you learn about what used to be here? What would it have been like?
The more you did it, the more you could imagine what it was like, and you could almost sense the ghosts of those great steam engines pulling maybe 20, 25 cattle wagons in their wake, you know, thundering through the landscape. The more you became acquainted with it, the stronger that image became, and in a sense, it's so quiet in places you almost felt like a ghost yourself. A lot of kind of strange inversions almost with the railway. I mean, when it was built, it would have been, in the 1870s, 1880s, when it was constructed, it would have been a huge change to a very rural landscape, whereas now it's almost the reverse. It's a kind of a path of wilderness through a landscape that's become more cultivated. This is, the kind of thing that would have, I guess, drawn my attention to the railway in the first place. We're looking at one of two bridges across the Silise River here. It's the second of two, lattice girder bridge, and had to make my way across this on my railway journey.
And you've mapped this and other parts of your railway journey, is that right?
Yes, that was one of the ways that I recorded the journey, was drawing little sketch maps in a notebook as I went along, and then for purposes of exhibition, I transferred them to a kind of a strip map. It's a way that I devised in order to recreate the feeling of being on the journey. Every little detail or difficulty that I faced, I made a note of it. Here we're arriving in Belleek, that's the station there, coming down to the Tome or Macneen River, which is in fact the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, which I swam across at that point.
Seamus's map formed part of an exhibition that included photos of his journey and objects he found along the way. I can really see how you could be inspired by these old railway lines. There's definitely something special about them.
This is where the Sligo-Leitrim line came into Enniskillen over Lough Erne, and from here passengers could go on to Dublin, Derry, Belfast, Omagh and Bundoran. But in 1943, services were disrupted as trains packed full of American soldiers arrived here from Belfast.
Thousands of American troops spent time in Northern Ireland during the Second World War. In fact, in 1944, they accounted for a quarter of the population of Fermanagh.
Can you tell me if this is the road to Enniskillen?
Billeted at 20 locations in and around Enniskillen, they undertook training in the lead-up to the invasion of Normandy in June of that year. One man with a personal connection to the GIs is Roger Edmondson.
Why are we here in this particular part of Enniskillen?
At this precise location, with this house here in the background, was where Eisenhower stood as he addressed the 8th Infantry Regiment, and he told them that never had a regiment been more ready for war. And my father was one of those troops. And my father's battalion, which was the 1st Battalion, were actually located at this spot. We had an ideal training location. And of course with Lough Erne here, we also had the aspect where they could do boat training. My father, every morning, he says, the drill sergeants used to put us into the lake. They started off by putting us into the lake just with our uniform, and then they found that we could swim a bit, so they put kit on top of us and they put us back into the lake.
But they didn't spend all their time in the water, and on their days off the soldiers were encouraged to explore Northern Ireland by train. This American Red Cross guide suggested places to visit, what to do when they got there, and also where not to go.
The trains had various uses, and in fact one in particular, we'll call it a day trip. The regiment here, my father's regiment, were put on board a train. I think initially they thought that this might have been them shipping out, but they were put on train. They arrived in Belfast. They then were put on board a troop ship where they were given a meal, and later on that night they come back to Enniskillen.
In fact, this was part of an elaborate ploy to flush out any German spies, keeping tabs on US troop movements from across the border.
Now the only way to try and tie these down, i.e. what phones they were using, where they were using, how big the network was to make something like a regiment moving out. A full regiment of 2,000 odd men. That is a big happening. So by the time the regiment come back that night, people were arrested, or other people of interest were given, let's say, a long leash so they could keep an eye on them.
The troops did finally leave Enniskillen on the 20th of June 1944. But during his time here, Roger's father had fallen in love with local girl Emily McFarland.
My father and mother met at a dance in Enniskillen, and that was the start of it. And as time went on, then they got married in the cathedral here in Enniskillen.
Roger's father survived the war, but like so many other wartime romances, theirs didn't end happily ever after.
When the war was over, the regiment had to go back to the States to be split up. My grandfather would not allow my mother to sail to the States with me. She would have been 21 by then. He would not let her go to, as he called it, a foreign country. In other words, the other side of the world. My mother was never to see my father again.
Enniskillen railway station has long gone, and so has any sign of where the tracks used to be. So to find out where I'm going to next, I'm going to call into the Barbers, obviously not to get a haircut, but to speak to a rail enthusiast and curator of one of Ireland's most unusual museums. Selwyn.
Barra, you're very welcome to Headland's Barbershop and Museum.
Selwyn Johnston and his brothers established this railway museum in 2002.
Well, the barber shop had operated for 30 years, and Nigel and Gordon are the barbers here, and we have a lifelong interest, all three of us had a lifelong interest in railways, and we actually had nowhere to display the railway items, and we decided, just quite by accident, wouldn't it be lovely to put a few items on display in the barber shop, and it just started from there. And perhaps when people come in, the fascination of a barber shop and rail museum where you can get your hair cut and then have a chance to wander around and study the railways and the local connection with Fermanagh and the steam links.
Well, so we've got a big list of battens here. What are they for?
Yes, these are signalling staffs. It was a safety system brought in the aftermath of the Armagh disaster, and you can see all the railway stations from Enniskillen right through to Bundoran, including the likes of Kesh, Pettigo and Belleek. And the staff itself had a series of rings, and they're all different sizes apart, and it meant when it went into the signalling staff machine in the signal box, it was quite unique, and it allowed it to unlock it for that particular stretch of line, and then was given up to the fireman, and he had control of that particular section of line.
What's your most precious item?
Oh, that's very difficult. Probably the railway bicycle.
Well, I know I like my exercise, but this is something different, isn't it? What was this for?
This was a track bicycle and used by the rail employees to inspect the line to make sure that everything was okay and the line was clear. So quite an unusual piece of apparatus.
So they would have gone right round in Northern Ireland in one of these just to make sure everything was
They would
fine.
have regularly travelled on the railway line, and you had to make sure you were aware of the timetable because you needed to know what trains were coming behind you, of course, and a procedure whether you took it off on the left or the right-hand side.
And presumably if you got your times mixed up, you just would have had to pedal faster, otherwise the train would have hit you.
Absolutely, I think that was the idea.
So what do you think the chances are that TransLink would let me drive this around the tracks?
I don't think so. I don't think there's any chance of that.
Once we were able to get a train from Enniskillen to Bundoran, how would we have done that?
Well, starting from Enniskillen, you would have went all the way to Ballinamallard and right through then to Bundoran Junction. On the map you can see where you would have made your way then from Irvinstown to Kesh, to Pettigo, through to Castle Caldwell, into Belleek and then Ballyshannon and Bundoran.
Now, it doesn't look too far away in the map. How long would it have taken?
It would have taken you about an hour and 3/4 to make that journey back pre-1957.
It's going to take a lot longer than that for me to walk
I'd
that.
say you better get started now.
If I had been making this journey back in the 1940s, I would probably have taken the Bundoran Express, a train, it appears, that travelled faster than the speed of light.
It was one of the quirks of the border that during the war, Northern Ireland adopted double British summertime, while the Republic kept to normal summertime. And according to train timetables, passengers could arrive in Bundoran before they'd even left Enniskillen.
I've been joined by Father Brian Darcy, who has a family connection with the railways in Fermanagh.
My father was a linesman on the railway in Enniskillen, and so we were kind of privileged in that we used to get a free pass once or twice a year, and that was our family holiday. The excitement of getting on a train and sitting up like a king in this lovely carriage with a seat of your own, if you don't mind. And you went down through the whole countryside, and you went to Bundoran Junction and Ballinamallard. You went down to Irvinstown, all the other names that you heard and would never see, only because of this wonderful train. Looking back at it now, the train was everything. It brought me away from my little village into Bundoran. It brought me from my little village to Omagh, big town, where I was educated. And the education I got there changed my life entirely. One of the most exciting memories that I have is Tyrone got into an All-Ireland semi-final in 1956. And my father called me one Sunday morning before 7 o'clock, and he says, "Get up, we're going to the match in Dublin." And I couldn't believe it. Dublin seemed like an eternity away, and I'm standing among 50 or 60,000 people. For a guy of 10, that was just incredible. Now, the possibility of going to that 2 years, 3 years later when the train ended, there was no point. You couldn't get to Dublin, and wouldn't get to Dublin because there wasn't a car good enough to go. The railway lines just didn't bring people on holidays and education and football matches. It also brought people to one of the most famous religious sites in the whole of Ireland. This was a place of pilgrimage. The entry to Lough Derg was Pettigo.
Well, let's see what's left of the station then.
It's amazing that it's still here because the platform very much is still here, but isn't it sad that it's not used?
On an island in Lough Derg, the sacred sanctuary of St Patrick has been a place of pilgrimage for 1,000 years. And today people still flock there to fast and pray.
Thousands of them came here through this village, through the place where we're standing in now. Lough Derg over the years will be having anything up to 20,000 to 30,000 pilgrims during this season.
The railway then was really crucial for those making that pilgrimage.
It was crucial for the vast majority of people coming here. It was an incredible way of getting people to come for 2 nights and 3 days of torture. And that's all you could say it was, in the name of religion, in the name of God. And people did it and felt refreshed and happy as a result of their experience. The railways in this part of the world are a fading memory. I was a young guy when the train stopped. So I'm an old guy now. So the living memory of a guy going to school on a train, going for a day out to Bundoran on a train, the living memory of a pilgrim coming to Lough Derg on a train is at its very end now, on the end of the line.
It's over 50 years since the trains rattled through here. It's hard to imagine they ever disturbed the peace and tranquility.
Belleek was the last stop before the railway crossed the border into Donegal on its way to Bundoran. But during the 19th century, Belleek was a popular tourist destination in its own right.
We tend to think of factory tours as a modern phenomenon. In fact, tourists have been coming by train to see round Belleek pottery for 150 years.
We can tell that from our very early visitors book, which was started in 1868 and runs right through to 1882.
So obviously at that time, the trains were very important to Belleek.
Yes, one of the reasons that they built the railway line was to bring materials to the pottery, such as coal and raw materials, other raw materials such as china clay and ball clay. And then in return, Belleek would send out the finished product out to market. And it's a bit like today, where you want to have broadband and you want to have the fastest way to access the internet. In those days, the fastest way to get to market was the railway.
But there's another story here, and it's quite remarkable. In June 1922, residents of Belleek had to be evacuated by train. Their village was caught in a battle between the IRA and the British Army.
This rarely seen footage shows British forces gathering outside Belleek before bombing the fort, which was held by a small contingent of IRA men. To find out more, I'm meeting historian Peter Leary.
I think you have to understand a little bit about the geography of the area. Where we're standing is in County Fermanagh and in Northern Ireland. The river there marks the border, and on the other side is Donegal. But if you actually travel just a short distance, a few hundred yards along through Donegal, you come back into County Fermanagh. So you couldn't actually enter Belleek except through passing what had become Southern Territory.
The border was still being drawn up in the summer of 1922, and this area, known as the Belleek-Pettigo Triangle, was strategically important to both Dublin and Belfast.
When the Free State troops occupied the fort on the hill in Belleek, and they also entered the village of Pettigo, it meant that a section of Fermanagh was effectively under their control. This was alarming to the northern authorities, and they feared that if this area fell to the south, or fell under their control at least, then that would eventually lead to it being ceded to the Free State.
Stormont appealed directly to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, none other than a young Winston Churchill. His response was characteristically emphatic.
Well, under orders from Churchill, a substantial contingent of British troops based in Enniskillen made their way towards the village of Belleek. They brought with them heavy artillery, the kind that they would have been using just perhaps a few years before in the context of the First World War, and they brought them just outside the village where they launched an attack, primarily on the fort, but inevitably also on other buildings.
This was the only time a battle was fought along the border between British and Irish forces. It didn't last long, thanks in part to the actions of one local woman in particular. When special police constables from the north became cut off by rail and road, Mrs. Laverton sailed her cruiser down Lough Erne to rescue them.
Mrs. Laverton became, I suppose, the human face of the story in much of the press coverage and newspapers and in newsreels that went around the world. It changed the narrative of what had happened here from an overreaction on the part of Churchill and of the Northern Ireland government into Ulster's plucky, gallant woman admiral who had braved the waters of the Lough and steered the police to safety.
Within days, the residents of Belleek were back in their homes and normal service resumed on the trains, packed with families eager to start their holiday in Bundoran. You'd never know it today, but this is where the railway once came into Bundoran.
Apart from the Great Northern Hotel, built by the railway company of the same name, and some local landmarks, there are a few clues to Bundoran's railway heritage. In fact, until the railway reached here in 1868, Bundoran as we know it didn't exist.
It was two separate villages, Bundoran and Single Street. They only came together and grew into a town when the railway came.
The railway made Donegal's most southerly town accessible to holidaymakers from Belfast, Dublin and even Glasgow. By the end of the 19th century, it had become one of Ireland's most popular seaside resorts.
The town flourished, and in the 1940s, the Bundoran Express brought war-weary families from Northern Ireland, keen to forget their troubles and their ration books for a few days. When the GNR closed its Fermanagh lines in the late 50s, Bundoran lost its railway too, and for a while the town's tourist trade suffered. But in recent years, it's bounced back.
Bundoran has reinvented itself. It's now the surf capital of Ireland, and people from all over the world come here to ride the waves.
The railways in the West may be gone, but they're certainly not forgotten. Throughout this series, I've met people passionate about the old railways. I've come across surprising stories and magical places. But what I'll take away with me when I'm back at my weather desk is the journey itself, walking the line.